You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio joining you, and we have a rare in-studio guest joining us. For those of you watching on video, also for those of you not, you'll be able to hear this even if you can't see it. But if you want to see it, go subscribe to us on YouTube or watch and listen on Spotify. But Taylor Lehman from Bite-Sized Bison joining us. Good to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I feel like I'm in like a some sort of like religious chapel or something.
Oh wow,
something. The Crimson Cast Center,
the Crimson Cast Temple. I like exactly. This is good. Yes, it's not that holy here, folks. Despite the all like kind of ethereal wall behind us here. I need to get back up into the regular studio upstairs. We're going to do that obviously over the summer, but we wanted to have Taylor on to talk about kind of the beginning of summer officially with IU football. We're now like to the point where IU's actually tweeting out the names of the guys that they got in the portal during the spring. We're a month past the spring game, actually slightly more than a month past the spring game now. So we're going to talk about roster. We're going to talk about calendar. We're going to talk about what to expect here as, you know, everything kind of takes a little bit of a nap for the fans in June and July. Things start to ramp up a little bit then, really ramp up in August, and the season's going to be here before we know it. So we might as well set the agenda, kind of take stock of where Indiana's at right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Like now things are going to be happening behind the scenes where, you know, you're going to want to pay attention to whatever channels you pay attention to for recruiting and things like that. Like June's the big recruiting month. There's going to be a lot of commitments to the 2026 class, which they've already kind of built up. The spring commitments have been really impressive this season or this cycle. And it's just a lot of speculation at this point. You're going to start to get a little antsy.
And that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, given that summer with IU football historically is more of a nap period for people, like, okay, wake me up, I guess, when the season starts. We're not in that mode at all. There's actually, I think, good reason to get really excited about this upcoming season. And summer's where it happens. You know, it's kind of like we talked about on the podcast last week. There's just so many things that you have to pay attention to now as an IU football fan that we just didn't have to pay attention to before. And that's a good thing. It's the cost of doing business at this level.
Yeah, one of the things that I talk about this all the time on social media, on Bite-Sized Bison, on Crimson Cast, I've talked about it, is something you might not have thought about is in June, teams host their team camps. Yep. And that's where they bring in a lot of people or a lot of recruits. That's where they start to build their coaching networks and they start to build connections, whether it's lower level college or high school. And so there's going to be there might be some talk about that. You know, there would definitely be visits around those camps. Yeah. And so that stuff is really exciting, especially if you have access to it. I don't think Indiana does anything like that, but it can be a huge event. And so that's probably something that, you know, I don't think Indiana fans really cared much to think about June camps.
I can't remember the last time I even got on my radar, and I follow this stuff relatively closely. Mm-hmm. So. Before we get into it, just a reminder, we're brought to you by Homefield Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. Taylor's sporting the oval. I've got this is the mock Corso. It's not the full Corso. The full Corso is in the closet.
You have a full Corso?
I have a full Corso as well as this one. I bought this as kind of an intermediate one, and this became kind of this became the crew neck that carried me through the entire 2024 football season. So I owe a lot to this crew neck. This crew neck saw a lot during this past season. And they've added more, obviously, and there's going to continue to be more IU apparel as we move through this summer and into fall. They've got great deals on a variety of things across college football. I think they released a Tennessee collection last week. I think they released an Oklahoma collection here recently. They've obviously got the Indy 500 collection. They've sold out of those white kind of multicolored bomber jackets for the Indy 500. They had a tweet up earlier in the store at the Speedway saying, like, these are the last 5. Once these are gone, they're gone. I mean, those went off like you wouldn't believe. So
there are a bunch of the Weenie 500.
Yeah. The Weenie 500 really captured the hearts and minds of America. It's amazing what, you know, mobile hot dog vehicles will do for people. But Anyway, if you'd like to get in on the home field action, go to homefieldapparel.com or follow them on socials. Download the app. You can use the code HOME23 and get 15% off your first order. And as always, let them know that we sent you. Just also a reminder, folks, subscribe to the Crimson Cast Substack, subscribe to the Bite-Sized Bison Substack. Crimson Cast free to start with. There's also a paid option if you want to help support the site. Bite-Sized Bison is, to me, the most automatic purchase that you can make in the IU media sphere if you love IU football. And I'm assuming if you're listening to this podcast that you are in that category. And a lot of great stuff coming up. What have you had this month? We're going to preview a little bit of it here, but what all have you had this month, and what should people look forward to over the summer?
It's been a busy week. I'm going to take a few days off now, but there have been 4 releases in the last 10 days. There's been offensive line talk for the entire Big Ten. There's defensive tackle talk and how Indiana's kind of reshaped that position. There was some predictive stats with SP Plus releasing this week, and how many wins might Indiana get. And there was a Bison Bites recently as well. So lots to read from the last 10 days. And then, going into the future, then we'll be looking at some different things around different positions and things like that. But yeah, it's been a busy time, but it's been fun.
Yeah, it's some great stuff, folks. So go over to bitesizedbison.substack.com. You can also just find our Substack, and it's got a link right to Taylor's. So go check that out. Let's go ahead and dive in. I think what I want to do is start first with the few portal additions and a couple of notes on the people that left during the spring. You and I last talked, I think, about this back in like February, or maybe it was early March, about where were the concerns on this team and what could they do in the spring portal. And it was interesting because there was obviously some player movement in that relatively short period in the spring portal. It feels like IU did pretty well with what they got, comparatively speaking, and a lot of it was just kind of adding bits and pieces where they were most helpful. There were a lot of schools that did not have similar success. We had that quote a couple of weeks ago from an anonymous assistant coach who was like, the remaining talent in the portal is basically like not anything that you can bring on your team. And interesting because IU was able to get a player away from a conference rival and, kind of round out a little bit what they did without really losing a ton themselves. What was your overall impression of what they did in the portal?
Yeah, I think a lot of people were expecting bigger splashes than there were in the portal. But I think, when you kind of look at some of the other teams and what they have brought in as far as transfers go, and then just considering Indiana's place within those programs and in college football at large, I feel like they made the moves they needed to make within the market that was available to them. Yeah. And, that might not be getting like a huge defensive end because there really wasn't one out there. And so there's always limited talent. And like you were saying, like the anonymous coach said, that talent dries up really quickly in the portal. So, we're looking at the few spring editions that Indiana's official account has announced on Twitter, and there are only 3. Right. And it's Kellen Wyatt, Jonathan Brady, and Stephen Daly. So you have like 2 edge guys on defense, and then you have the wide receiver.
Let's start. Let's start with Brady, because this was a position and a pickup Indiana didn't think that they were going to need to do prior to spring practice starting. And then, of course, Mekhi Jackson tears his ACL, I think it was.
Tyler Morris,
sorry. Mm-hmm. So you end up with a need there. And they pick up a player that's already played with Fernando Mendoza, who was pretty productive last year. It was surprising that they were able to grab him so quickly, because it was not that long of a turnaround between when that injury happened and when you ended up getting this pickup.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously working with Fernando Mendoza helps a lot, but also a little bit surprised that this type of receiver was still out there.
Yeah.
And, that he is very versatile. I think he'll be able to do a lot of the things Tyler Morris could do, maybe just a slight step down. But having that familiarity with Fernando Mendoza is going to go a long way. And he also, the thing about Cal and Fernando Mendoza and Indiana, Mike Shanahan, all of them together, the 2 schemes are very similar.
Yeah.
It was just more passing at Cal than it was at Indiana because the offensive line was weaker. And so it took a lot of pressure. This type of a system takes a lot of pressure off of an offensive line. And so, Fernando Mendoza and Jonathan Brady are used to playing within a system like this. So when you watch Jonathan Brady's tape from Cal, it looks a lot like an Indiana offense. It's like short passes, but also, some deep cuts, and he's done it all. Yeah. And that's what you want from a receiver that's going to have to fill the role that he's going to have to fill, because he's going to be very important to this team this year.
Yeah. I mean, they had a plan, they went out, they get Morris. That seemed like an underutilized player at Michigan. And I'm sure we'll see him back on the field at some point in the future for Indiana, but you really wanted to have a front line of wide receivers that you could rely on, and it's like Indiana's got at this point kind of 5 experienced receivers, and then they've got a young core of people that they're probably going to be mixing in as time goes by, and you're breaking in a new quarterback, but he'll have had the entire spring and summer to work with those guys, which is exactly what Indiana had last year with Curtis Rourke, except Rourke was, as we learned, injured through part of that process. So who knows how much of that chemistry was really able to get there before the season started, which might have explained why Indiana started a little bit slow offensively last year.
Yeah, for sure. And having, and I mean, even like even carrying over into the defense, they start off slowly too. So there's going to be, a buffer period in the beginning. That's why you have these non-conference games, but also, that Illinois game, that's the game where you have to have things figured out. So yes, having a guy like Jonathan Brady playing slot receiver, a position that is so important in Mike Shanahan's offense, and having that familiarity, that chemistry already. Fernando Mendoza is already building this chemistry with the other receivers. That's something he's not going to have to worry about for an offense that needs to get it together early.
Let's talk about the 2 edge pickups for IU. As you mentioned, Stephen Daly and Kellen Wyatt. So what can you tell us about each of these players? Like, what's their background? What are they bringing to the table for IU? Why are they important pickups?
Yeah, Stephen Daly is he's definitely a defensive end, but he's not necessarily a defensive end in the same sense as like a Mikhail Kamara, where he's going to be as productive in his pass rush attempts. He'll put pressure on. He's not great at getting to the quarterback, but he will play like a true defensive end position. Kellen Wyatt is a little bit different. He is a linebacker defensive end hybrid. If we didn't know Mikhail Kamara was already being the stud defensive end, I would say that this is his position, but he's about the same size as Kamara. But I think what we'll find is that he is going to play a lot more in space on the edge. And that's something that Indiana didn't really have last year, or at least didn't really have in an effective way, where he can be moved around in space on the edges. I think you're going to see him often, but he's not necessarily going to have like a established position within the defense.
And
yeah. I think, the,
well, I get one of the things you talked about before was the concern kind of going into spring camp was the lines. Yeah. And we'll talk about the offensive line here in a minute, but it's depth, it's rotation. It's also, as you mentioned, kind of style of play. And I think just the general idea of what is Indiana going to rest on in terms of this is where the identity is. And you talked a lot about last year, the way that the defense was able to disrupt the opposing offense. And that was really what carried them, especially in the second half of the season, it felt like, across the board. And it does feel like overall there's been a talent upgrade, not just in terms of your starters, but in terms of who you can throw out there at any given time. And that's what Indiana has to get to. I mean, we've talked for many years, IU football has always struggled with the depth. And there was even a piece today in Athlon Sports that was talking about how they're kind of halfway there. They don't have true top end depth. You may not need it as much as you did 10, 15 years ago in the Big Ten because of how unbalanced the schedules are, but you still need it if you're going to compete at the highest levels, which is clearly where Indiana wants to be at.
Yeah, and in today's college football, you're not really going to have it in the same way the other programs have had it in the past. It might even have to come in the form of young players developing quicker than normal so that they can be available when that depth needs to be called, because teams are going to have to call on young guys they're not expected to put on the field every year. Yeah. And I'm thinking like Daniel Ndukwe is the first one that comes to my mind. He put on a lot of weight. I didn't even recognize him at the spring game. And so, if there is an injury at defensive end and Daniel Ndukwe gets thrown into that rotation, he might see more snaps than you would expect. And so somebody like him is going to be the depth. But they do have a lot of depth on the defensive front. Yeah. And that's really encouraging for Bryant Haynes, because Bryant Haynes, the thing about their defense is that halfway through they started creating these new packages and they became much more effective against the run, and it became difficult for opposing offensive coordinators to figure out how to combat this defensive front. And so you always have to be evolving and changing things. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing from Bryant Haynes with these, particularly Kellen Wyatt and these transfers that he's bringing in, because you do have that depth along the defensive line now. Yeah.
So 3 seniors essentially with Kamara, Daly, and Wyatt. You've got Andrew DePape and Ndukwe as sophomores, and you have a kind of a cadre of younger players. There is a lot of depth there. 9 players that you would classify as defensive ends, and then you've got 7 players, including the newcomers that we already knew about, and Jose Wheeler and Dominic Ratcliffe as in the middle of the line. So it's a lot to work with within all of that. And it does feel like, as much as we've talked about some of the other areas, secondary or whatnot, defensive line just in general looks like it could be another strength for this defense.
Yeah. Because when you talk about like defensive identity, that is the interior defensive line for Indiana's defense, but it can't look the same way every year, or else it's going to be sussed out. So if you had, say you brought back CJ West, well, CJ West is going to be a target for opposing offensive lines. So, when you're looking at this, it's like, okay, well, Tyree Tucker might fill in that CJ West role, but it's going to look different than it did last year because Tyree Tucker's not CJ West. And so, you're going to have, you're going to mix in like a Mario Landino, and then some of these other, like Jose Wheeler, he's a very versatile defensive tackle. And so you're going to be able to move them around. There might even be like instances where there's 4 defensive tackles on the field at the same time. And then maybe with Kyle Kamara on the outside. So we already know that there's going to be more 3 linebacker packages this year too. And just based off of the depth in the linebacker room, which is insane, that it's going to be a crazy good defensive front. And that's why I really dove into the offensive lines in the Big Ten earlier this week.
Well, let's talk about that. We do want to talk a little bit about just in general, IU's offensive line. This has been something that has been pointed out. Like, this could be an issue. It might not be an issue, comparatively speaking. But just to rehash for everybody, you bring in Pat Coogan, who would probably have been starting at Notre Dame, if not for the other players and the way that their offensive line kind of shifted in terms of who was going to be starting. You bring back Khalil Benson, which that's an interesting saga in and of itself. And then you bring Zen Mikulski, who had been at Ohio State and wasn't going to start at Ohio State, but could blossom into something here at IU. And then you bring back Carter Smith, Drew Evans, Bray Lynch. You've got some younger players who are clearly depth pieces by and large. But you had a piece, which I'm going to switch over to here on the video for those of you who are watching, where, because we were talking about this, and we were like, is Indiana, we know Indiana probably doesn't have a perfect offensive line. Does anybody in the Big Ten have a perfect offensive line? Or, as my contention was, without looking at data, is it a situation where the teams that Indiana's playing against, by and large, maybe are in the same spot as IU, which kind of creates a neutralization thing. And so, you did a really nice data viz where you were looking at both returning snaps as well as snaps that they had gotten with the team that they're playing for this year in the Big Ten. And it's interesting because if you're looking for something to promote the idea that Illinois is going to be a breakout team this year, this is probably the chart you're looking at, as they have the highest combination of both returning snaps and snaps from elsewhere. They clearly use that as a focal point for this offseason.
Yeah, if you're watching on video, the green bars are the returning snap, or the snaps that have been played at Illinois among their current offensive linemen, and the purple are the snaps that have been played elsewhere. So, for example, with Indiana, Khalil Benson, his snaps elsewhere are counted as purple, but his snaps with Indiana are counted as green.
That's nice job by you.
So it's significant because it serves two different functions. This shows in the Big Ten how many snaps along the offensive lines cumulatively are coming from returners and how many are coming from the portal, and it's damn near even,
right?
And which is these are like the two. This is all the two deep, so the two the starters and backups projected for each team, and so it is really interesting. So, but snaps are not synonymous, well,
you can be bad snaps. I mean, you look at this, like Northwestern's got a ton of snaps coming back, and I think everybody is very concerned about what's going to happen to Northwestern football this year. Rutgers, another one where they did not have a great season last year. What's fascinating, if you scroll down this chart, is Michigan has like the fewest total snaps in the Big Ten, less than Purdue, less than Maryland, less than Iowa. And that's a team that on the one hand, you could say, well, it's Michigan. They'll be fine. They always have great offensive line. I don't know if that's as true in this current era because you're not stockpiling 4 and 5 stars necessarily. If you're Michigan, you've got to have some tested experience because guys are coming in from everywhere. With, as we saw last year with Indiana, you can have players who maybe hadn't played that great before, and maybe they can perform. But Michigan's also going to be starting a rookie, like a freshman quarterback in the mix. There's a lot of things that they're going to have go right on their line.
Exactly. When you want to decrease the number of variables that need to go your way, And so even Ohio State, I would say that they're kind of comparative to Michigan, not nearly as in much of a dire situation, but their tackles are both transfers, one from Rice and one from Minnesota, and neither of them graded particularly well from the PFF, and there's probably talent there that can be developed in different ways at Ohio State, which is encouraging for them. But even the snaps that come back on the interior, it's like there's a lot of snaps there, but they're not necessarily great snaps. So can you count on them developing and being a crush for your offense and the way that it needs to be? Maybe not. And when you're looking at Michigan, like that's tough because you're expected to win a championship every year at Michigan.
I find wild how few snaps Purdue returned on their line. That like there's barely any green.
I can't remember what that number is. But it's like I think it's like 72 snaps they returned on their offensive line. Yeah, it's nuts. But they rebuilt their entire starting front out of the transfer portal. So that'll be an interesting case to see. 3 of them come from UNLV.
Yeah.
And one came from Canada. And so it'll be interesting at Purdue. I don't think it's going to be a good year for the Boilermakers, but it's just a matter of being competitive. But yeah, the offensive lines, I even ranked them lower down the list.
Oh yeah, I'll get this down.
Indiana is I think I had them 5th and among the Sorry, it's kind of a waste.
No. It's all right. Is it all the way down at the bottom here? Okay.
I write too much in these things. No, there it is.
No, this is what the people are asking. This is why Bite-Sized Bison is such a great subscription, folks. But yeah, if you look at the rankings here, Penn State 1, Iowa 2, Oregon 3, Indiana 4, Wisconsin 5. Not ideal that Indiana has to play the teams with the top 3 offensive lines.
Yeah.
But Indiana's 4th. I'm sure that they're probably looking at that and saying something along the same lines.
Yeah, and that's what makes it interesting too, because in the second season of a Brian Haynes, defensive front, you expect some improvement there because they're improving the talent and also the system's becoming more refined, and he's second year in the Big Ten. But then also you're combating these offensive lines that look to be the most promising going into the season. But they do also play some that are pretty rough too. So
sure.
So if you're thinking about like which offenses are going to have success against Indiana's defense, the offensive line is the first place to start. Can they hold that Indiana defensive front? And I think for most of them, probably not. There are just a lot of concerns along every offensive line, and that was what that's whole thing. That was
kind of my point.
Yeah, it spawned from the conversation that you and I had, which was like, we're not super confident, and you may not be super confident in Indiana's offensive line. So how does that compare to the other positions, like you were just saying? And the answer is it's actually pretty good.
Yeah. I mean, and look, every team's going to have some flaws. Every team's going to have some things that they would have liked to have addressed. This is where player development has to come in. And what the numbers are showing us and what we're projecting based upon what we think the players that are there and the coaching staffs that are there can do. It's really very much dependent on, well, who rises to the occasion. And that's going to be a really fascinating thing, I think, to keep in mind as we go through all of this, because at the end of the day, IU has demonstrated, this coaching staff has demonstrated, they have that ability. Like they can develop players into their system and get something out of them that they, either you didn't think they could do at this level or that we hadn't seen up to this point. So that's really, I think, if you're IU, you can hang your hat on that. And they're not the only ones. I mean, the teams that are in the upper echelon of the Big Ten, with maybe Illinois is not so much an exception as much as they are like we've kind of seen it under Brett Bielema, but we haven't completely seen it. They haven't completely broken out yet. But certainly Iowa's done a great job of development. Oregon does a great job of development. Penn State's done a really good job of having a system that they can run guys through. So, now it's really about matchups and, how do you get through this summer period and how dialed in do you have your guys to the game plans on a week-to-week basis?
Yeah, absolutely. And like we were saying before, the thing with Illinois is that, they return a lot of snaps, but you're relying on those starters to be good. Like if you're at this chart here, Illinois did not necessarily grade well as a starting unit. And so when you bring them all back together, you have to count on them having developed as a full unit, because I think they ranked it's like 14th or 15th among their starters.
14th,
in the Big Ten last year. And so you bring all of those guys back. It's like, okay, is that quality? And that's just to be determined.
Yeah, I think ultimately with Indiana, what made that offensive line work as well as it did for most of the games was they clearly were able to play well with each other. And where they did run into problems, they, with the exception of the Ohio State and Notre Dame games, were able to do just enough to give the offense breathing room to score what they needed to score. And then the defense essentially did the rest. And even in the Ohio State game, the defense, for the most part, did what it needed to do. The mistakes happened in special teams and on the offensive side of the ball. So, as always, I think the other thing to keep in mind here is it really feels, from the quotes I've seen from the offensive line and from the coaching staff, like there's more belief that this works. They've seen it in practice or in games, I guess, and in practice. There's likely a greater sense of, we know what success feels like. And as improbable as last season was, going in knowing that now, I think will allow them to get to where they need to get to faster than even they did last year.
Yeah, absolutely. And adding somebody like Pat Coogan, who came from Notre Dame, that not necessarily you necessarily need that. He said something in an interview, I think it was with the players' perspective, within the Hoosiers Connect. And he said that when you are brought into a program, when he's coming from Notre Dame to Indiana, he said they're all kind of the same. Like when you're around winning players and winning coaches, they're the same. And so that was really encouraging to hear as somebody who was like, is this offensive line for real? Like, is it going to hold up? Having somebody like Pat Coogan, who was at Notre Dame, say that about Indiana's offensive line and Indiana's program is, I thought that was encouraging, just for vibes' sake.
Yeah, which we're all about the vibes here, let me tell you. Another thing I wanted to kind of talk about in general was who departed in the spring in the portal. Was there any surprises to you, and how would you characterize the players that ended up departing in the portal in the spring?
Yeah, I think the biggest surprise, just off the top of my head, actually I can't remember which ones left in the spring, but the Austin Barrett, I remember that one being somewhat of a surprise. The backup tackle, heard really good things about him, particularly from the Allen administration, and he went to Iowa State, which suggests that there is talent there,
right.
And he was clearly, it was a mutual decision. He joined his brother at Iowa State. So I don't think that was too big of a loss, except for the fact when you look at the depth at tackle, it's not too encouraging behind Zen Mikulski. So I think that was probably the one that hurt the most. I don't think there were too many surprises. There were definitely some from positions that I thought, could take some cutting. But it is interesting because, you could tell that it was a quality. It was a quality. It was a decision made for quality's sake.
Yeah.
And because Indiana still hasn't reached that 85 scholarship mark, and so there wasn't necessarily a plan in place to replace that. It wasn't like a one for one change.
Right.
It was actually this room could be better off if we could, or the team could be better off if we took this from the room and put it somewhere else.
Do you anticipate any of the guards doing some double duty then? Because as you said, you got Zemikowski, you've got Carter Smith, and then you've got two freshmen, and Evan Lawrence and Austin Leibfried. That's your tackles as they're listed right now.
Yeah. I think in an emergency, I think Khalil Benson, because Drew Evans should be back at some point this season. So if there was something to happen to say like Zim Mikulski, Khalil Benson could move over, or something were to happen to Carter Smith, which would probably be pretty terrible.
Yeah.
Zim Mikulski can move to left tackle and Benson can move to right tackle. Evans could take the place in the right guard or something.
So talk about the offense in general at this point. You've got an interesting mix of players. Obviously, Fernando Mendoza goes in as the unquestioned starter. And you've got a really interesting running back room in that, you've got Kalon Black, who was kind of probably the least heralded of the three-headed monster last year, but still had a lot of good moments. But then you bring in Roman Hemby, you bring in Lee Beebe. You've got Solomon Van Horst, who's popped in and out, but has never been like a regular. And then at wide receiver, you've got a really impressive spread of different types of skills. EJ Williams is back again.
Yeah.
Welcome back, EJ. Omar Cooper had a really under the radar season, I think nationally, but certainly showed a lot. You've got Surratt back. It's an interesting array. And, even at tight end, there was some additions that changed the way that IU has used the tight end position and what they've stocked there. It's a very different type of talent profile.
Yeah. The offense is interesting. I think I talk about in BSB about multiplicity of the defense. I can see some multiplicity in this offense too, because there is some speed in this offense, but you can also make it power, and so having the tight ends that they have, and Nowakowski and Holden Stace, I think in the way that they were being used in the offense during the spring game suggested that they can be used in space. They can be used a lot like Zach Horton was last year, and be block on the move. And I've said for a while that I think there could be a lot of two tight end sets in this offense, but we didn't really see any in the spring game.
No, we didn't.
It was pretty much all one tight end, and so I'd be curious to see if that's exactly what they want to do in the season, because both of these guys seem talented and that they can be on the field. And then James Bomba, of course. But, I think Roman Hemby offers a lot for this offense. I think he can work in the passing game and the running game. Lee Beebe's a power hitter. So those two guys, I think Kalon Black is, probably waiting for an opportunity, because I think it's going to be mostly those two. But he's a great third running back to have and a great team guy too. So I think a wide receiver, I think there's a lot of talent there, of course. I'm curious to see how Omar Cooper is used this year. I didn't think he got enough targets last year. And then,
that was a popular comment in the YouTube comment section as well. Yes.
Yeah. I think he could have been targeted more.
Backing up a little on that. Do you think that was a product of Rourke's injury? Because it just kind of felt in general as the season went on, he just felt more comfortable throwing to his left, which is where Elijah Surratt was located.
Right.
And it felt like Cooper, not just directionally, and I was kind of joking about that, but it kind of felt like Rourke really, what we thought was an offensive design to get the ball out quickly. There might have been some injury related items there where it's like, I don't have time for Cooper to get as far down the field as he needs to fully take advantage. And normally by that point, Surratt or somebody else had gotten open enough that you could throw the ball.
That's the thing. I will say, Omar Cooper, he was used. So the way that Mike Shanahan will set up those longer passes is he'll have the shorter passes. And then it's almost like a pitcher with a fastball and a changeup. You throw that fastball and then you throw the changeup in the same tunnel, but it drops. And so it's the same situation here. You have those short passes that have similar looks to the longer that then turn into longer passes later on. So if you find success in those shorter passes, then the longer passes, those become options. And Omar Cooper wasn't really built into those from what I could see.
Yeah.
And so, he had that deep crossing route that was really what he really excelled at and what he was asked to do. So I'm curious to see if he does more or if he's more involved in those deviations. But Elijah Surratt was just a really reliable guy on the sideline that could catch a lot of those, a lot of the fades. And I don't know if Fernando Mendoza is going to throw as many of those. Curtis Rourke was particularly good with those throws. So and I think Fernando Mendoza, I think he is already kind of trained to do what you need to do in this offense to use the entire field. Yeah. And, that might include Omar Cooper.
Yeah.
But, I think the wide receiver room really hinges on EJ Williams and the depth that he offers at the back of that starting pack. Before you really get into like Charlie Becker and LeBron Bond.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very curious to see how they leverage all of these guys, because it really feels like if you add the tight ends and Roman Hemby into the mix, you've got like 7 guys that can catch the ball really effectively.
Yeah.
And you still want to have a running game, obviously, but I could see this offense being better than last year's offense in a lot of ways. The protection might be better. They might have a little more time. You have a more mobile quarterback who sees the field a little bit differently. And as good as Curtis Rourke was, if they can stabilize up front a bit more and give themselves more time to do things, even if it's just an extra second here and there, that can make all the difference in the world. And, it's one of the things where I think we're kind of trained as IU football fans to think about, all right, how do we stop the opposition? We're not really always thinking about how does the opposition stop IU.
Yeah.
This was essentially the chemistry of the Kevin Wilson era, where it didn't work enough because they just couldn't stop the opposition enough compared to how often the opposition couldn't stop IU. But this is going to be a situation where you can have faith in the defense. And if the defense can hold a team to 24 points, I like this Indiana team to score 28 or 31 or 38 or whatever. They look like they're a team that can rack up a lot of points, especially through the air.
Yeah, and offense can be a good defense. Pacers fans know that.
Yeah.
Rest in peace, Cavs.
Sorry, man.
No, I think you're right. I think if you can really find a lot of success like they did last year, they found a ton of success. They were the number 3 team in success rate last year. And if you can find a lot of success on offense, that puts a lot of pressure on other offenses to also perform as well. And like we were just talking about with offensive lines, I'm not sure if that guarantee is going to be there for a lot of these teams.
Yeah, it's just a curious aspect, and we won't know. And I will say, again, the schedule lays out really well. And we saw last year, it took a little bit of time to hammer things together. People were nervous after that first game because the offense wasn't clicking, but it feels like the runway is there once again between Kennesaw State, Indiana State, and who's the third team? Charlotte? No.
Who is the third team?
Wait, I promise I know. Charlotte was last year, obviously. We've got it here in the calendar. It is Old Dominion. Yeah, it was. But blue and green are kind of close. I'll use that as an excuse.
I've kind of categorized those games as like wins.
I know.
So I haven't really thought about them that much.
Probably we shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
But, although on the other hand, I guess at this point, maybe we should do that. But you've got those 3 games in a row leading into that Illinois game. But I like this because it gives everybody a chance to gel a little bit more. It allows you to play some depth, see who those next pieces are that you can bring up. And we haven't talked about the secondary and the linebackers yet. That was kind of the last thing I wanted to hit before we talked about win totals and schedule and whatnot. But you were worried a bit about the secondary going into the offseason. How do you feel about it now?
I'm still worried.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
I think, but not alarmed. I think, last season, and I've said this before, there's like the luxury, and it might be Derek Owings, it might just be luck. The fact that there weren't a ton of injuries. It seems like Curtis Rourke just like took all of them and just played through them himself.
Yeah.
But if there was an injury in the secondary last year, that still would have been concerning. This year, I think cornerback is pretty safe. It's the safeties that I'm a little concerned about, and safeties are significant because there's 3 of them in this defense. So,
right.
there aren't a lot of safeties behind the starters. There is Bryson Bonds, but you have Amari Farrell, who played very well last year. Lewis Moore comes back, and I don't think that's necessarily a guarantee in terms of his quality. He played okay at Ole Miss in his snaps. So there's no. It's not automatic he's going to come back and be the same safety that he was before. And then Devon Boykin, he seems legit. He seems like from NC State, from what I've heard from like his past coach, some of the quotes that he said when he was injured, that guy seems like really legit. So I think he'll be at Rover. And so, but the thing is, those three safeties, they kind of play very similarly, kind of like a net behind this defense to make sure that things don't go awry when there's not havoc created by the front line. And so that means, they're not necessarily leaned on as much as some other defenses. They'll play a lot of, cover 2 or even cover 1 or cover 3, sorry. And so that's encouraging, but if one of them goes down, it's kind of steep from there from what I understand. That might be different.
Yeah, no, I mean, it does feel like with a lot of this team, and this is where the transfer portal activity that IU was able to engage in was so important, because clearly, there were a lot of players that Allen had recruited that just do not measure up in the eyes of this coaching staff.
Yeah, most of the cuts in the spring were from the Allen era.
Yeah, and that was to some degree, I guess, somewhat expected, and frankly, like I think for a lot of IU fans, it matches what your impressions were of the way that talent development or not was happening under Allen. They clearly had brought in a bunch of guys who just weren't quite at this level. But there's a huge freshman class. There's 33 players who are classified as freshmen right now on this team. And you've only got 6 sophomores. You've got 17 juniors, 25 seniors if you want to add in the COVID guys. Yeah. And so you've got a lot of young depth. There may be opportunities for some people to break through. You've got, in the secondary alone, you've got 7 guys listed as freshmen. That's an interesting thing. And I'm curious to see if we see any of those guys pop up and end up being regular contributors just out of necessity.
Yeah, so that's the thing. Like, we don't really know how good Byron Baldwin is, that 4-star safety. And that's significant. The Jaja Boyd, he came with a lot of encouraging talk, because he was the highest rated recruit or highest rated commitment, I think, maybe even signing of JMU's program's history, but it was still outside the 1200, right. The top 1200, so Byron Baldwin significantly rated higher. And so, is he somebody who can step right in as a true freshman? He looked pretty good during the spring game. So maybe, but yeah, they've definitely prioritized the bringing in high school defensive backs, and they've brought in a lot of talent. And I think, a lot of that is because you have Rod Ojong and Ola Adams back there. And it's like, okay, let's give these guys some talent and let them cook. And as far as like developmental wise. And so, there will probably only be a couple more years of this before these guys really start stepping in and making their mark. But yeah, that's the thing, Galen, like, it kind of more of a general point, but, you have, and it kind of goes back to that point from the Athlon Sports article. Like they're like halfway there with their depth, because they've brought in all these transfers the last 2 years. They're probably gonna have to do another year or 2 of that. But then by the time that by the time they're get sick of it and the talent's starting to come up, that high school talent that they're recruiting is going to be able to play. Yeah. And so that's what you're kind of leaning on here. So the fact that they do have all those freshmen is really encouraging. They probably won't all make it to the field. There'll probably be some transfers out, but yeah, no, the defensive back positions are encouraging for the future. It's just this year, can you trust any of those younger guys to step in? And I don't know.
I mean, if you can get one each, if you could get one at corner and one at safety, it kind of fundamentally changes the dynamic of what you've got back there.
Yeah.
But and it's interesting because physically there may be the smallest delta between where you need to be physically as a really good high school safety or defensive back and where you can be an effective one at the college level. It's not like, offensive line, you're having to put on a ton of muscle and you're really having to reshape your body. So it's not unheard of that you could have someone pop up there. And the nice thing is you've got enough top end that you don't have to press somebody into a ton of action unless something goes catastrophically wrong injury-wise.
Yes.
You mentioned the linebackers earlier on, and I did want to circle back to them real quick. So obviously Aiden Fisher's back. That's huge because he's really, ends up being just kind of the central point for everything. What else in this linebacking core are you excited about right now?
Elijah Hardy first. I mean, that guy has a nose for the football. It's like ever since he started getting significant snaps in 24 and then even in the spring game, like he just forces turnovers. And he's one of those guys. I'm trying to think of somebody who was maybe just like Mike McFadden.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to compare him to that, but like his ball hawk skills are like that. And then I think, PJ Nelson, well, obviously if we're talking about like on the field, Isaiah Jones is probably the next one that I would note. He can play both positions, which is encouraging and something that Brian Haynes has said from the beginning. Caden Turner looked pretty good on the field during the spring game too. But then, I would say Kellen Wyatt is like kind of considered within this group because he'll be, I noticed something in the spring game, which was they took the redshirt freshman Quentin Clark and they placed him in somewhat of a stud position, just like on the edge. He would fall in next to the defensive line on right on the line, even in like a 4-point stance, or he would, fall back. And I'm not really sure what the read was there, but I think that's how they're going to use Kellen Wyatt. And so I think Kellen Wyatt is somebody who could be considered like a stud defensive end without necessarily being in the stud position. Yeah. So I think, Kellen Wyatt kind of serves that role, but then a PJ Nelson, the true freshman linebacker, they really like him and he's big. Like I saw him on the field and he was talking to Signetti and I was like, man, who is that guy? Cause obviously I don't know his number. And I was like, that's the true freshman. Okay. And so, I think he's going to be somebody and I think he might be like the Aiden Fisher type. Yeah. And so, PJ Nelson's a name to look for in the future.
Last thing we'll talk about is special teams. Obviously, you get Nicholas Radicic back. So it's good to have a kicker that's had some experience. Yeah. And then new punter, UCF's Mitch McCarthy, another Australian.
Yeah.
But had a pretty good season last year. I think averaged 43 yards a punt, was pretty good at getting the ball inside the 20. That low-key, James Evans struggled down the stretch after starting really well, and it impacted a couple of games for IU. It's special teams is so odd because you can plug and play guys into those roles because they're largely individual roles in the football team. But it is going to be interesting watching what happens on special teams for IU. Those margins are always important, and clearly you just want to score a bunch and not have to worry about it. But it's nice they were able to go out and get somebody who was relatively accomplished at the punter position.
Yeah, absolutely. From UCF, and his numbers are fairly similar to James Evans, but a bit more consistent throughout the year. And then I think bringing back Mark Langston, I didn't know he had another year of eligibility. And I saw him on the roster. I was like, oh, wow. Okay. I mean, that's good news. You have to have a good long snapper. So, the experience that he brings is huge. I think he's a significant retaining.
So let's talk kind of first schedule. So we go into this summer. What are we going to be looking at for IU? You mentioned the camps. We've seen advertisements for a bunch of them, and a lot of players obviously kind of participating in one form or another. They got their own camps to some degree. But what are we looking at here over the course of June, July?
Yeah, so there will be those camps, and whether players participate in those camps or not is also something to look for, because that means staff is going to want to see more from them, or sometimes it depends on the relationship. But if they're in the camp, then that can be good news or bad news for some some recruits. So, but no, I think June is really significant because the dead period begins on June 23rd. So all of the official visits up until June 23rd are going to be kind of like final pitches for some of these programs, the 2026 recruits. And there will also be a lot of really talented 2027 guys in town too, particularly in those camps. And so I'm thinking of one particular recruit, defensive tackle, McHaney, I think is his last name. His last official visit is Indiana, which is the weekend right before that dead period.
This is the guy that's also got Purdue on his list and a couple of other guys.
Louisville, and a couple others as well, Vanderbilt. And so, those are really, that weekend, June 20th, is really significant.
Well, we saw today, Kobe Cherry out of Center Grove announced his final three, and it's Indiana, Wisconsin, Purdue.
Yeah.
interesting kind of
right.
and obviously Indiana's got a little bit of a benefit there as they have a family member on the team. This is a really fascinating and important period. Let's stop there for a second. Indiana's got 9 signings for the 26 class, and they've clearly reset their expectations as far as who they think they can go after and effectively get. And also, they're not just ceding the state of Indiana to other teams as they have historically. What name or couple of names stood out to you the most out of this initial slate of commits that they had over the course of the last month?
Let me take one look real fast, because I've been looking at a lot of names recently, Galen, and I have it right here. First of all, I mean, the Henry Olinger from Columbus, the linebacker. He is not out of the woods yet. That is not a commitment that is like a guaranteed signing.
Explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, so there's particularly in Ohio, I covered a lot of recruiting in Ohio, covering Ohio State, and the way that Ohio State recruits their state is that there will be a mutual waiting period. And so, because they both have this understanding that Ohio State is looking for the top talent in the country, and so if there is a slot that comes available and they believe that this is a good talent to add in that slot, they will come back to this player. And so Henry Olinger has one official visit left open. And so, there's a possibility that something happened, because you have to take them all the way to the finish line, through the season and everything.
Yeah, because you got to get to the actual signing. Because these are just verbals at this point.
Yep, exactly. So, and he's out of state, of course, but there are a lot of them in state. First of all, Gabe Hill is another one. This class, man, this class is really good. And I remember telling you like a year ago, I was like, this class is going to be there. This is going to be a huge class. But the Gabe Hill is the interior defensive lineman.
Yep.
Really solid guy. I can't remember the schools that they ended up actually signing or gaining his commitment over, but he's somebody on like a Henry Olinger level, kind of a top 300 guy. And
Iowa, Illinois, Tennessee was in that mix. Texas A&M was in that mix. Notre Dame was in that mix. Yeah. So those were all offers that he had. And this is the player out of Naperville in Chicago, which is not an area that Indiana has necessarily recruited particularly well historically.
Yeah, and if they do, it doesn't necessarily result in a lot. Yeah. And that's kind of the case with a lot of Chicago area recruits, is they're kind of hit and miss. Indiana's kind of similar, but so getting somebody like Gabe Hill is encouraging, especially this early. Yeah. Like when you're getting commitments from like Olinger and Hill, top 300 guys, before June even arrives, because a lot of commitments are going to be happening in June and July, especially during the dead period in July, because they'll have just finished their officials. And like a lot of these guys still have a full slate of official visits to make, which is notable too. Right. You have to hold on to them through those official visits, because some of these guys can be kind of flaky. So, that's significant. But I will say the in-state is what really has stood out to me in this class. And that is Blake Smith, Trevor Gibbs, and Casimir Hicks. Yep. Casimir Hicks it depends on which service you're looking at, but he's the top recruit in the state, according to On3. And then, if you're looking at 24/7 Sports, it's number 3. Right. And so he is, he's very talented. The other two are as well, but it's not even necessarily the talent that's the point here. It's like the just the fact that they're prioritizing the state,
right,
and wanting to. Yeah,
we were talking about this with Zach last week, Zach Browning from On3, and I noticed this, On3 does this nice thing where they'll have like the average distance from where a player is from to the team that they're committing to. And this year, the average distance is 237.1 miles. Last year, it was 595 miles. In 2024, it was 360, which is still over 100 miles more. It was 664 miles in 2023, which obviously represented a lot of what Tom Allen and his staff were doing, which was Florida and Georgia, Tennessee as their primary bases. But we've talked for a long time about how there's plenty of talent in the state of Indiana. You just can't, immediately be like, oh, okay, Ohio State, Michigan, Notre Dame, you take all of the top talent. Wisconsin, Iowa, you come in, you take the 3 stars or the 2 stars that are going to develop, and then you're kind of left with whatever. And Indiana, even when they have recruited well in state, a lot of times their top in-state recruits have not panned out. So this is going to be interesting because these guys seem legitimate. Like this is not the traditional package of, well, the offers they had from elsewhere were relatively soft in nature. So I am curious to see how it all pans out because it's clearly a long way to go.
It's interesting because I don't want to, obviously I don't like slamming in-state kids, but like the top talent that you were talking about that would come in and would not, necessarily develop, a lot of that they were guys that were highly rated that these other programs looked at and they were like, I don't think we want to take that kid. And so then it became obvious why, but then also Indiana didn't necessarily do a great job of developing talent either. Right. So even Brady Allen is one that I was really high on. And I saw him, throw in front of Ryan Day. And I thought for sure he was going to take off somewhere because he went to Purdue, then he went to Louisville. And I don't think he's really played much at all. And so he was an in-state player from, I can't remember now, but it's really encouraging that they're looking at these guys and they're getting these commitments early, because it's not necessarily one of the situations where these other programs are like, yeah, we're going to let this one go, Indiana or whoever can have him. It's more like, we're going to get this commitment on the front end. And, those other programs are going to have to convince him to flip.
Yeah. It's going to be an interesting thing moving forward. Anything else calendar wise post camps that we need to be thinking about this summer?
Not necessarily. With the rev share stuff, we know that.
Well, who knows on that? I'm still waiting to do a podcast where I can talk about all of that. It's like, is going to settle something at some point?
But the calendar, it starts to slow way down. You have this really fast period leading up to June 23rd, and then a waiting period on the other side of that. That's a lot of commitments. Obviously, there's a lot of phone calls and things happening. The coaches aren't sitting back at all. Right. But then after that, you start getting in. There are some visits like after the dead period, early August, but then you start getting into like summer camps, and the attention turns toward, the season ahead rather than recruiting.
Let's talk about the last thing I wanted to talk about here, which is the projected win total. So we finally got the first version of S&P Plus for this upcoming year. Bill Connolly published it a couple of days ago, which you can use to kind of run analyses about what the probabilities are for what win total. So Indiana was 23rd in S&P Plus, which is I guess given their, what they've got returning and kind of the question marks there, it seems fair to start with. It's a marked difference from where they were last year. Because what were they, 81st?
81st,
when they started the season. So you do have to take these things to some degree with a grain of salt, because all it can do is look at the numbers. But to be top 25 coming out of an off season when everybody's like, is Indiana just a flash in the pan? That makes you feel pretty good, I think, as an IU fan. But Taylor ran the numbers for projected win totals. Let's get that chart up, and you can see here. The most likely scenario is 8 wins with a 31.2% probability that Indiana goes 8-4 in the regular season. But 9 wins is almost as likely, 28.6. And, it's more likely that they would win 8+ games than they would win fewer than 8 games. And as you said in the tweet that you put out about this, like 6 wins would be a real disappointment given the numbers. It's not impossible they go undefeated. It's a 0.1% chance, which seems like a very little bit. But as we'll see in just a minute, that's a better chance than they had of winning 11 games last year. Mm-hmm. So I guess, first of all, when you look at these things, you do have to some degree take it with a grain of salt, in that these are probabilities based upon everything being exactly as the computer says it's going to be in terms of team strengths and offensive, defensive, and special teams play. And that's rarely how it works out. There's injuries, there's overrated and underrated teams, there's things that happen that are surprises. But this is really positive when you put it through 20,000 simulations that this Indiana team is going to, have an 8 or 9 win season or better, which, as I'll note again, would be a top 5, top 10 season in Indiana football history.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It does lean heavily on the SP Plus formula because this is SP Plus data. All I did was put together a simple win probability model and created this visualization. But it's interesting because I think with all the excitement around the program, it's easy to forget I don't want to bring up any demons or anything for
No,
Indiana football fans, but they've only been to 6 bowls this century.
Yes.
And but the probability of them getting to bowl eligibility this year is like 93%.
Right.
And that's insane. That's the first thing I noticed.
I think it's higher than that. I think it's actually closer to like 98%. Because like if you
no, you're right. Actually, I did that incorrectly. Yeah, because you have to get the 6 wins. Yeah, I included the 6 wins in the not up bowl eligibility. Yeah, you're right. It's like 98%. That's
bonkers, as I would say. That's not normal here.
Yep. And so and like you were saying last year, and we'll look at the other
before we do that, I wanted to get to this is very small for those of you who are looking at this. But if you look at the overall S&P plus rankings, so looking where Indiana currently sits coming into the season, SP Plus has them with the 30th best offense, the 25th best defense, and the 29th best special teams. That's great. And it's interesting because it's a very consistent line across all 3 of those areas of play. And, you go up the chart, like Miami comes in with the best rated offense in the country, but the 44th rated defense in the country. Now, they play in the ACC. You don't really need defense there. But there's the inverse, like Tennessee, 34th best offense. We'll see. They don't have, who's their quarterback right now.
Yeah.
But the 7th best defense. So a lot of this, it's LSU's kind of a more extreme, better version of that kind of thing. But you look down the list, and the teams above Indiana in the projections in the Big Ten, Ohio State, who they don't play, Penn State, who they do play, obviously on the road. You've got Oregon, who's 7th. Penn State was 3rd. Ohio State was 1st. And then Michigan, which I have questions about that ranking.
Yep.
It leans a ton on their defense, which their defense is very good, but as we saw, not completely impenetrable. And then, you roll down the list, and Illinois and Indiana are very, very close to one another. One's at 19th, one's at 23rd.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of top-heavy competition in Indiana's schedule, which is in the most recent BSB that I put out. I included all the FanDuel's win total lines for each of the teams, and included which ones Indiana plays. And there are like tiers to their competition level, and a lot of this is reflected in the SP Plus ratings. But yeah, the Michigan one's very interesting to me, and I think it just kind of highlights how SP Plus can account for many things, but it can't account for everything. It can't account for the fact that there is a true freshman going to be playing quarterback behind an inexperienced offensive line. Like that kind of data doesn't necessarily come through here. So that's it is interesting that they are that high, but as you were saying, there could be overrating, there can be overrated teams, there can be underrated teams. We saw, just this last year that Indiana was one of those underrated teams. So this is far from an exact probability.
Yeah.
But
and like we said last year, I mean, let me go ahead and call it up, because this was the first thing I asked you.
Yeah.
When you sent me this, I was like, what was the probability last year for Indiana doing what they did? And you waited a minute and you texted me back, and he's like, it doesn't actually compute.
Yeah.
So if you go back, and this is the 2024 chart, Indiana's most likely scenario, I remember seeing the John Punt guys talking about this at the beginning of the year, was 5 wins.
Yeah.
And it was more likely they were going to miss a bowl last year based on the S&P Plus numbers than make a bowl. I think they only had the accrual was about a 24%, 23% chance, 24, 25, whatever, of making a bowl. And 11 wins. What was that projection? You told me it was 0.03%.
That was 10 wins.
That was 10 wins.
10 wins was 0.03%. To reach 10 wins was 0.03%, and 11 wins didn't register. In 20,000 simulations, not a single season for Indiana in 2024 resulted in 11 wins. Now, if I went to 100,000 simulations, there might be some, but just in 20,000, there were 0 that resulted in 11 wins. There were more that resulted in 0 wins than resulted in 11 wins. And there's not going to be a season like 2024 yet.
No, it's that will go down, I think, as one of those I don't even know what you would describe it as. And at some point, I would love to have you do a deep dive and go back through the last 15 years of college football, or however long we've got S&P Plus data, and find out what was the most improbable like good or bad, what was the most improbable season that a team had based upon their starting numbers? Because that's got to be in the top 5, I would think.
Absolutely. And I've done something similar with EPA, where it was like EPA change. And it was one of the highest, if not the highest, amongst Power 5 teams. And it was the biggest positive change between seasons. And there's a lot of statistical analysis to be done on that season still, but it's wild. But it also is, it goes to show that, I don't want to, I don't want to bring bad vibes into this, but if in the chart, in the first chart, it was like 0 to 3 didn't register. So could you have a 3-win season this year?
I mean, we've learned nothing is impossible, right? I mean, if everything goes wrong, I will say though, it just like the quality of this coaching staff and the systems they've got in place and just the mentality. It feels like the places that, and we've seen it at IU a bunch, the places that are susceptible to that don't have those things.
No, there is a high floor at those programs.
The only program I can think of that like was that feast or famine was Michigan State. During that whole area, you go from making the college football playoff one year, and then a couple of years later, you've got like a 3-9 season. I think it was 2 years after that. It was that 2016. It was the last year that Wilson was here.
Because that was they brought down the goalposts in Memorial Stadium.
Yeah, that was the spittoon game. So it can happen, and I don't have I cannot get my head wrapped around Michigan State football in general. It is. It's the chaos agent, it feels like, for the entirety of college football in a lot of ways, and not just in recruiting, but success that just go through the last 50 years. It's right up there with Auburn and a couple of other schools that can go feast or famine very quickly. So,
and looking at the schedule, Galen, if you scroll down on that and included in the bottom, I don't want to say too much because this is behind the paywall, but
if you've made it through an hour and 6 minutes of this podcast, you'll leave a little bit of a taste.
True. Yeah, I should reward the Crimson Cast loyalty. There are those hinge games that you and I have talked about. I think we talked about in our last episode, which is when you're looking at Iowa and Illinois. Those were the 2 games, and then I even brought up Wisconsin too. Those are the 3 games outside of Penn State and Oregon where they have the lowest win probability right now, according to SP Plus data. And the only one that they're projected to lose is at Iowa. They're projected to beat Illinois just barely. And then Wisconsin, 71% against Wisconsin, which is a little surprising. I think Wisconsin can outplay their
Wisconsin might be the kind of the inverse of Michigan this year, where they're kind of getting slept on by the numbers because they did not have a very good season last year or the year before. And it's interesting, like the Luke Fickell experiment there is, I wonder, like, if they get off to a difficult start this year, like, is he in trouble at this point? Because that entire athletic department is kind of predicated on their football team being really good. And especially with teams like Indiana and Illinois kind of getting the rise, and Wisconsin no longer having the benefits of the Big Ten West to get those appearances and get those locked in games against Purdue and whatnot. It's a tough one, and so we'll see what happens with them as they move forward. The hinge game thing is interesting as well, because I think one of the things that we're looking at is the way, like that. The fact that they have a 45% win probability at Iowa is baffling to me. Like, it's hard to get my head wrapped around that. But what I will say, and it kind of goes back to something I said earlier about culture and the building of a feeling that you can do things. The fact that they were able to go into so many opposing stadiums last year and play well for at least a little bit, in the Ohio State game, and then obviously they played great at Michigan State. They played, really well at Northwestern. That was a tougher game, I think people thought, but they pulled out the victory. Like, they've got those under their belt now in a way that they didn't before, and that it's going to be interesting having that Illinois game and then the Iowa game back to back. And then a bye, and then you got to go to Oregon. Like, that sequence is really going to be a general hinge point for the entire year, because you don't get Penn State until November. You've got to come back. You've got to play well in those home games you've got against UCLA and Wisconsin and the other team that they have in that mix. It might just be those 2. But there's just a lot of those sorts of things that I'm curious how the mentality of this team and the muscle memory, for lack of a better term. They're at Maryland is the other one that's in that mix, which is another interesting game, and another team where that might be the team that there's the least amount of belief in when you compare it to the fact that they've had some fairly decent results and they're recruiting well. But God, they lost a ton of players in the portal, including players to Indiana. It's interesting. It's not just one. It is interesting kind of what's going on with Maryland athletics and Maryland football in particular right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that is one thing that these numbers don't necessarily take into account is the order at which the schedule takes place.
Right.
Because we were just talking about how last year the offense started pretty strongly, but it didn't seem like it was either side of the ball didn't seem like it was in its like evolved state until later in the season.
No, it's like the second half of the Maryland game was the first time I really felt like, because I remember people forget, maybe they don't forget, but Curtis Rourke throws a couple of interceptions early on in that Maryland game. The weather's not great. You're kind of like, oh boy,
Twitter was burning up.
Yeah, and then it flipped on its head in that second half, and Indiana ended up winning that game. And then kind of a similar thing happened in the Northwestern game the following week. But that was where the hype train started. And then obviously everything that happened with the Nebraska game and the Washington game completely changed the tenor of the season. If you do what Indiana had to do the previous year and you start at home against Ohio State in the first game and you get ground into a pulp, maybe that goes completely differently. So the order is really important, I think.
And it kind of bolsters your point too, because I remember in that Maryland game, you could see the chess match happening. You could see the changes happening between the coordinators. Like Mike Shanahan was trying everything to find some leverage there, and eventually they did. And that is something. When that is happening, you don't leave a lot of things to chance,
right?
And so, like you were saying, like with the coaching staff and having a floor, like that is, that's how, like I was joking earlier about 0 to 3 wins. Could there be a 3-win season? That's how you don't have those, because you don't leave things to chance. You don't have an initial game plan and then abandon it. You are actually, competing.
It is interesting that if you look at the box score from the Maryland game, Indiana has on its roster 56 of the points scored in that game, even though Indiana only scored 42 because Roman Hemby had 2 runs in that game.
That's true.
Well, that's not technically true because Justice Ellison is no longer here and Tyson Lawton. But it's interesting because like Maryland's coming in with a team that only scored 14 points, from that game because the other 14 are on the roster at this point. So anyway, don't look too closely at the box score because I also missed the Donovan McCulley touchdown. That was in that game too. Anyway,
towards the end.
Regardless, point still stands. Anyway, Taylor, this was a lot of fun. And obviously, we'll keep up to speed. Bite-Sized Bison will keep chugging throughout the course of summer. So will Crimson Cast. We'll continue to talk about IU football as events warrant. But thanks for stopping by. It's great to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is fun.
Thanks for joining us here again on Crimson Cast, folks. We'll be back with more podcasting. At some point, we'll cover the House settlement and what's going on with NIL and rev share and everything else. Not today, though. Have a wonderful Memorial Day. For those of you who are doing the Indy Double on Sunday, I'll see you there at both of them. Stay never daunted. Bring back the Bison. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. So, everybody.